Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Anyway, this video is about Hosni Mubarak, who's just dead. So it's not quite Ave Adquawale, him. He shall not be missed, though he made a positive contribution in some respects. So Mubarak, he was president of Egypt from 1981 to 2001. Mubarak just died at the age of 91 in Kahira, and no doubt will be buried in that unconquerable city. So his surname means blessed, and to a few of his supporters he was blessed. He certainly blessed a few of his acolytes. So he'll be interred today, if it wasn't yesterday, because Muslims do tend to do this very fast and have their Salat-i-Janaza before the sun sets twice. Remember, Islamic law is obviously invented in Saudi Arabia, a very hot climate, no way to preserve the bodies in a morgue or something. So that's why they tried to bury them fast before they started to distend and rot. So Mubarak, he's born into a middle-class family. He entered a military academy. He became an Air Force officer, eventually rose to be head of the Air Force, and was quite conventional, going along with Nasser, not particularly into socialism. Obviously, it was a socialist country. It was aligned with the Soviet Union. It wasn't actually a communist country. It was a fairly secular state for a Sunni Muslim country at the time. And women wore what Westerners would consider normal clothes in the Egyptian cities. In the countryside, it was more traditional. But one of the major developments of his lifetime was obviously these Arab-Israeli wars. And Egypt was fairly successful. The 1973 one was about to lose, but it wasn't going to be such an ignominious defeat as the previous ones. But Egypt's relative success, and that was partly down to him as chief of the Air Force. But anyway, in the 1970s, Anwar al-Sadat, the president of Egypt, had engaged with Israel and the United States and was being brought out of the Soviet orbit into the Western orbit, not to be a NATO country, not exactly a Western ally, have a good relationship with the United States. And would he say, well, these wars against Israel are just not working. We've lost 4 of them. Why don't we make peace? And so they did. Now, this was something that Mubarak was opposed to for various reasons. Solidarity with their Arab brothers, the Palestinians, also Muslim religionists, and was it worth it being in the United States orbit? They would be rejected by the rest of the Arab world, as indeed happened. But anyway, when the Camp David Accord was signed, Egypt started getting billions of dollars in aid from the United States. They patched up the relationship with Israel. They weren't going to be attacked on that side. But it was unpopular in Egypt. At least a large majority were distraught. They detested this deal. They felt it was a betrayal. They've been called Judas by the rest of the Arab world. And Egyptians employed in Gulf countries often lost their jobs over it. So some people vowed to assassinate Sadat. And indeed, in 1981, that November, at a parade to commemorate their success in the Yom Kippur War, Sadat was indeed shot dead, and Mubarak was sitting very close to him, was lucky to escape with his life. But as Sadat was dead, Mubarak became president, and then he reigned on. So he continued those policies which he had so adamantly opposed. So Mubarak was very unusual for an Egyptian of his era to speak fluent English. In the 1950s, he already mastered English. English was not so widely spoken as it is today, because we think, oh yes, but lots of people all over the world speak English. Not so in the 50s. Obviously, there were the major Anglophone countries like Canada, the US, Australia, the UK. And in former British colonies, let's say India, there would have been a small minority who could speak English, not loads like today. In countries like Germany and the Netherlands, yeah, quite a few people had learnt it. But outside that, very, very few people spoke English. So it was a bit of an advantage to him when he was engaging with US presidents and so on, meeting foreign diplomats in the 70s. His wife's half British. He had 2 sons with her. People thought he was grooming one of his sons to take over from him. That didn't happen in the end. So his party were called the National Democrats, probably quite ironically, and hold these hugely fraudulent elections. They allowed opposition candidates. People might have thought that was quite a liberty. People might have thought they were actually allowed to vote for the opposition candidates. So there was a fairly controlled media. I say it was a secular state. Like, yes, there was alcohol was legally available in hotels for foreign tourists, but there was a limit, and you couldn't outrage public decency. Had a very broad definition of that. What that was, an Egyptian woman showing her legs in public in a dress was charged with gross indecency, and on and on. And you couldn't insult Islam; that would be a crime. So he's very much against the Muslim Brotherhood and didn't want a full-blown Shariat state, but managed to keep reasonable relations with Islamist fundamentalist countries such as Saudi Arabia. And it was important because so many Egyptians were working there. So the aid they got from the United States was worth 20% of Egypt's GDP in 1981, but then a population explosion. Public health care got better, they tended to have several children, and they just couldn't keep up with that. They just weren't creating enough jobs. So he really failed in this regard. And he was a kleptocrat, and he and his cronies creamed off billions of dollars. So he had so much of that salted away in foreign bank accounts. It was very difficult to get anything done without paying bribes. So the administration was sclerotic, and there was a lot of job creation, a lot of non-jobs. These sinecures created for civil servants who were working about 10 minutes a day just to show up and draw some kind of a salary. So a lot of people living on $2 a day, and the economic growth wasn't there. Tourism is quite important to the economy, but one big terrorist attack, and that would really radically reduce tourist numbers for a couple of years. And obviously, the Islamic extremists cottoned onto this, which is why from the 90s they were carrying out terrorist attacks, deliberately killing foreign tourists, partly because they're infidels, but also to wreck the economy. And then that will cause so much discontent, people might support a drastic solution to their problems, which would be a revolution. Well, this couldn't go on forever. The situation's getting worse with mass unemployment and underemployment and growing inequality. Cairo is just so overcrowded. There's horrific traffic. It's very polluted and so on. It's just unlivable. I was there in 1986. It was bad enough. Heaven knows what it's like these days. Anyway, it was also a destination, Egypt, for Western female sex tourists to find toy boys, particularly Luxor. But there were huge scale protests in 2011. He brought the military onto the streets, but they engaged with the civilian population, saying, "Don't kill us. You know, we are the people. We're fellow Egyptians. This is a non-violent protest." Nevertheless, over 1,000 Egyptians were killed by the security forces. We're told this is relative restraint. And now, I thought at this point, Mubarak, you should see the writings on the wall. You've had 30 years in charge. You're already in your 80s. You've got well over $1 billion stashed away in some foreign account. You know, get on a helicopter and fly to Saudi Arabian airspace. You'll be there within 30 minutes, and that's it. And then announce you've resigned. But he didn't do so. It was too late. He was overthrown. The military finally withdrew support. To keep him in office would have taken something like a Syria situation, would have taken deliberately killing tens of thousands of civilians. And that's why Assad has clung on, because he's got absolutely no ethical scruples. He is willing to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians of his own nationality, to use poison gas on a large scale in many, many attacks. And so Ben Ali, one of the least brutal dictators in the region, he was overthrown relatively easily, only a handful of deaths, because he, well, and indeed and his army, were not willing to slaughter thousands of civilians in the streets. So that was Mubarak put on trial for various crimes. About the 900 civilians killed. Was it on his orders? He didn't order them not to. He didn't try and penalize the police or the military for excessive use of force, and sentenced to life imprisonment, even though he was very unwell, wasn't judged to be too ill to stand trial, and both his sons convicted of plundering state wealth. But anyway, he was released in 2017, so he served only 6 years of that. So he's said to feel complete disdain for democracy, feel that it's just not applicable to the Middle East. And I suppose he's a man who knows what he's talking about. So Egyptians thought they had a change of government in 2011, but they didn't really. The military transitioned to democracy, but military courts were still trying civilians well into 2001. There are all sorts of other things like homosexuality is illegal in Egypt, and there'd be someone would log onto a gay chat room and say something saucy, and then find they're actually chatting to an undercover police officer, be arrested, and on, tortured and used in his jails. And Western countries were usually willing to turn Nelson's eye to that because he was secular, because he was against Al Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth. Now, I say it was secular, it wasn't exactly the Netherlands, but it could have been a lot worse, and people didn't want it to get worse. Israelis are very worried that the new regime, when the Muslim Brotherhood won the only fair elections Egypt ever had, would go to war against them. But they said, no, we'll call for observance of the treaties. Bear in mind, the United States have been selling all this top military equipment to Egypt for decades, and now the US and Israel are quite worried that their armaments were going to be turned against them. It's a bit like the situation in Iran in 1979. And the Muslim Brotherhood, they are conservative Muslims. I wouldn't say they're fundamentalist. Then they tried to bring in the Quran as the law of the land, but they were certainly observant Muslims, and Mohammed Morsi was president. Shan't talk too much about him. But he had 1 year to try and sort out an incredibly testing situation. Didn't quite manage it. He was overthrown by the military dictatorship again, and they've had these charade elections ever since. So back to status quo ante. So Morsi sentenced to death for I can't remember what. Over 1,000 unarmed people shot dead by the army shortly after Morsi was ousted and the military dictatorship came in. The silence was deafening from the rest of the world. Why wasn't this denounced as a vile atrocity? And people just shrug it off as though it doesn't matter. So anyway, Hosni Mubarak is gone. He achieved a few good things, but I think it was a dream gone sour. He could have achieved so much more, having been in office for 30 years, try and get people to have fewer children, try and improve the quality of life for people, diversify the economy. But no, he was an authoritarian who did little to lift people out of penury, which is why he ultimately paid for the price for that. But he suffered relatively little considering all the crimes he'd committed against his people. 'Twas ever thus. Well, follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook. Book lessons with me and about politics, history, religious studies, geography, French, law, English literature, and English as a foreign language. And choose me as your tour guide in London. Right, make sure you're subscribed and please continue donating on Patreon and PayPal. That's georgecallahan79 at gmail.com. Toodaloo.